At 5:58 in the morning on October 15, 2024, 40 federal agents surrounded a church, not a boarded-up building on the edge of town, a 12-acre campus in southwest Houston, Texas, with a marble fountain out front and a blue neon cross that stayed lit all night, every night, rain or shine. Inside, in a filing cabinet nobody had thought to lock, sat a ledger that would end everything. 61 names on it, 61 so-called ministries, spread across 4 states, every single one registered to collect tax-deductible donations, every single one a shell. FBI Special Agent Michael Torres stood outside the sanctuary doors holding a search warrant, a Kevlar vest strapped under his jacket in the dark. Behind him, 2 tactical teams fanned out along the property line in staggered positions, one covering the administrative wing, one holding the parking lot exits, headlights off, radios set to a silent channel, so the only sound on the property was wind moving through the live oaks along the fountain. A third team waited by unmarked vans 2 blocks east, engines running, ready to transport whoever came out in cuffs. Torres had walked this exact stretch of sidewalk 3 times in the preceding week, memorizing entry points, counting security cameras, timing how long it took the overnight custodian to cross from the fellowship hall to his truck. He'd spent 19 months getting to this moment. 19 months of subpoenas, a wiretap that failed at the worst possible time, and one accountant who simply would not sign a piece of paper. The number on that paper was $340 million. That's what the FBI says the Gulf Cartel laundered through Harvest Grace Ministries between 2016 and 2024. Not through car washes. Not through strip malls or used car lots, the usual playbook. Through donations. Blessed, receipted, tax-deductible donations, dropped in a collection plate on a Sunday morning. Somewhere in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, a cartel plaza boss named Diego Montoya had found something better than a car wash. He'd found a church. Here's where this story actually goes, and it isn't where you'd expect. It ends with 58 sealed indictments cracked open in a single Houston courtroom in under 6 hours. It ends with a bank compliance officer flipping on her own employer, but it starts 3 years earlier, in a windowless back office, with a 34-year-old accountant staring at a spreadsheet that did not add up, and deciding, against every incentive he had, not to sign it. Harvest Grace Ministries opened its doors in 2011 in Houston's 3rd Ward, in a strip mall storefront that used to sell tires. Pastor Raymond Kessler was 39 years old, a former insurance adjuster who'd found God, or said he had, after a divorce and a bankruptcy filing in 2008. Colleagues from his adjusting days remembered him as a meticulous claims man, someone who could find the exact clause in a policy that let a payout through, or kept it from going out at all. It was a skill, they'd later say, that translated uncomfortably well into finding the exact clause in a nonprofit's paperwork that let a dollar move without anyone asking where it came from. He started with a folding table, a box of canned goods, and 40 people on a mailing list. By 2015, Harvest Grace had a real building. By 2017, it had a fleet of box trucks. The turning point was Hurricane Harvey, which hit the Texas coast on August 25, 2017, and flooded roughly a third of Houston, underwater measured in feet, not inches. Kessler's food pantry became a disaster relief hub almost overnight. Local news ran segments on him. He prayed at a city council meeting that October. Hands raised, cameras rolling. Donations that had trickled in at a few $1,000s a month turned into hundreds of thousands. Kessler's wife, Diane, ran the books. She'd been a bookkeeper before the ministry, and she kept every ledger clean, every receipt filed, every donor thanked with a glossy annual report full of smiling volunteers and hurricane wreckage. On paper, Harvest Grace looked like the best story in Houston nonprofit circles. A husband and wife team who'd built something real out of a flood. What almost nobody knew, not the city council, not the donors, not most of the staff, was that 2 years before Harvey ever made landfall, Raymond Kessler had already taken his first dirty dollar. It happened in 2015, when the ministry needed a warehouse and had no way to pay for one. A local real estate broker introduced Kessler to a group of investors willing to front the capital in exchange for a quiet equity stake in a property trust. Kessler didn't ask where the money came from. The wire arrived from an entity called Rio Grande Legacy Trust, registered in Delaware, controlled by nobody Kessler ever met in person. He got his warehouse. He never asked the question again. That's the detail that gets left out of every version of this case that focuses only on the raid. Harvest Grace wasn't infiltrated by the Gulf Cartel. It was built, one warehouse and one wire transfer at a time, by a man who decided early on that some questions weren't worth the answer. By the time Hurricane Harvey turned Kessler into a local hero, the arrangement was already 3 years old. The flood didn't create the laundering operation. It just gave it better cover, and a lot more volume to hide inside. That's the first thing worth sitting with here. Every disaster this country has ever had generates a wave of real generosity. And somewhere in that wave, someone is always fishing. Before we go further, it's worth putting a face to what that wave actually looked like from inside the pews, because the people who filled that collection plate every Sunday were never abstractions to the case file. They were the whole reason it worked. Maria Delgado was 61 years old in 2019, a widow who cleaned offices downtown 5 nights a week and had been a member of Harvest Grace since the folding table days. She gave what she could, usually $20 or $30 a week, and in 2020, after her daughter's car was totaled in a hit-and-run, she told church staff she couldn't make her usual gift that month. Records agents later pulled show the building fund logged a $310,000 deposit the very same week, tagged as a capital gift from an anonymous donor. Maria Delgado never knew her $20 sat in the same ledger, on the same page, as a number 300,000 times the size of her own sacrifice. When investigators eventually interviewed her in the fall of 2024, she wept not because she'd lost money, she'd given what she could afford, and never regretted a dollar of it, but because she'd spent 5 years believing her small gifts were part of something that fed hungry families and rebuilt flooded homes. Finding out that number belonged to someone else's crime, dressed up next to her own genuine generosity, was its own kind of theft, one no restitution order would ever really repair. Here's what nobody expected going in. The man who eventually turned Harvest Grace inside out never carried a badge. David Ruiz was 32 when Harvest Grace hired him in 2019 as a staff accountant. He had a wife, a 2-year-old daughter, and a mortgage in Pearland, 20 minutes south of the city. The job paid well for a nonprofit, better than well, which he chalked up to Kessler's fundraising success. Ruiz's role was narrow: reconcile the general ledger, prep documents for the outside auditor, keep the books tidy for the annual donor report. For his first 18 months, nothing looked wrong. Then, in early 2021, Ruiz started noticing entries under a line item called the Building Fund. Deposits of $180,000, $310,000, sometimes over $1 million, wired in from LLCs he'd never heard of, with no invoices, no board resolution, no explanation beyond a memo line that said, "Capital Gift." He asked Diane Kessler about one of them. She told him it was a major donor who preferred to stay anonymous. He let it go, once. The second time he asked, in the fall of 2021, the answer was less patient. He was told, in Raymond Kessler's own words, that questioning donor intent was not his lane. Ruiz went home that night and told his wife something felt wrong. He couldn't say what yet, just a feeling, the kind you get when numbers that should tell a simple story keep needing a new explanation. He started staying late at the office, not for overtime pay, but to quietly cross-check line items against bank statements after everyone else had gone home, working by the light of a single desk lamp because he didn't want anyone walking past his office window to see what was open on his screen. What finally broke it open wasn't a single huge number. It was Sunday attendance. Ruiz cross-referenced the church's own attendance logs against the reported cash offering for 11 consecutive Sundays in early 2022. A congregation of roughly 600 people was reportedly dropping an average of $41,000 a week into the collection plate, in cash. That works out to about $68 per person, every single week, in a working-class congregation where the median household income was under $52,000 a year. The math didn't just look generous, it looked impossible. He ran the numbers a second time, and then a third, half hoping he'd made an arithmetic mistake somewhere, because the alternative meant something he didn't want to be true about people he'd worked beside for 3 years. He raised it a third time, in writing, in March 2022, ahead of the annual audit. He refused to sign off on the financial statements without a real explanation for the building fund deposits and the cash offering totals. 2 weeks later, he was let go, officially for budget restructuring. He walked out of the Harvest Grace campus on March 21, 2022, carrying a cardboard box with a framed photo of his daughter, and, in his bag, a flash drive he had quietly copied before his access was cut. He didn't fully understand what he had yet. He just knew it didn't belong in a landfill. That flash drive sat in a drawer in Ruiz's house for 4 months. He was scared, unemployed, and unsure whether flagging it would end with him in a lawsuit, or worse. His wife found him one night sitting at the kitchen table with the drive in his hand, turning it over like it might tell him what to do if he just looked at it long enough. What finally moved him was watching Kessler on the local news that July, accepting a civic award for outstanding community leadership, standing at a podium not 10 miles from the storefront where Ruiz used to work. In late July 2022, Ruiz drove to the IRS Criminal Investigation Office in downtown Houston and asked to speak to someone about a nonprofit. The IRS opened a preliminary file, then referred it to the FBI's Houston field office in September 2022, flagged for potential Bank Secrecy Act violations tied to a religious nonprofit. That file landed on the desk of Special Agent Michael Torres, a 12-year veteran of the Financial Crimes Squad who had spent most of his career chasing shell companies, not churches. Torres brought in a partner, Special Agent Elena Cruz, who'd cut her teeth on a Beltran Leyva case out of the McAllen office 2 years earlier. Neither of them expected much at first. Torres later admitted the file almost got shelved. Nonprofit financial irregularities cross federal desks constantly, and most turn out to be sloppy bookkeeping, not organized crime. What kept it alive was the flash drive. Ruiz's copied records included internal spreadsheets that never made it into the public-facing annual reports, raw deposit logs, wire confirmations, a private tab labeled simply BF, short for Building Fund, that Diane Kessler apparently maintained separately from everything shown to the board. Torres opened the case formally on January 9, 2023. Internally, the Bureau called it Operation Second Collection. Officially, it began as a straightforward financial crimes review. It would not stay that way for long. The obstacle came almost immediately. On paper, Harvest Grace's public financials were immaculate. Diane Kessler had run a genuinely clean-looking nonprofit for a decade, and the fraud, if there even was one, lived entirely in the gap between the public reports and Ruiz's private files. Files that, as a former employee's personal copies, carried real legal risk if used carelessly in an affidavit. For the first 4 months of 2023, Torres and Cruz built nothing they could take to a judge. 3 months of subpoenaed bank records came back looking almost boringly legitimate. Every wire had a matching grant disbursement. Every disbursement had a recipient nonprofit with its own 501 paperwork on file with the state of Texas. That's when Cruz noticed something Torres had missed. There wasn't one recipient nonprofit. There were 61 separate ministries, incorporated between 2016 and 2023, registered across Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Names like Rio Bravo Family Outreach, Second Harvest Fellowship of Lake Charles, Cornerstone Youth Alliance of Tulsa. Each one had a bank account. Each one received wire transfers from Harvest Grace's Building Fund, tagged as grants for community outreach or disaster relief coordination. Each one, when agents pulled the paper trail, dispersed the money onward within days, usually to a construction company, a trucking firm, or a real estate holding LLC. None of the 61 had a physical address that matched an actual functioning ministry. 19 of them shared the same registered agent, a paralegal in Baton Rouge who filed incorporation paperwork for $200 a form and had, by her own later testimony, never once met anyone associated with the entities she filed for. What agents were looking at, laid out on a whiteboard in the Houston field office by June 2023, was not a church with a bookkeeping problem. It was a laundering network with a steeple bolted on top. To make the 61 entities usable in an eventual courtroom, Torres assigned a 2-person forensic accounting team to build what the Bureau internally called the Entity Book, a binder, eventually running to over 4,000 pages, cross-referencing every incorporation filing, every registered agent, every bank account number, and every wire transfer against the Building Fund ledger Ruiz had copied. It was slow, unglamorous work. Forensic accountant Priya Nair spent 6 weeks alone, just confirming bank routing numbers against IRS Form 99 Zaidi filings. flagging discrepancies with colored tabs until her office looked, in her own words, like a kid's book report gone wrong. The entity book would later become the single most cited exhibit at grand jury, the spine the entire prosecution hung from. And it existed because one analyst was willing to read 4,000 pages of filings nobody else wanted to touch. The Bureau requested a court-authorized wiretap on a phone linked to one of the 61 Shell directors, a man named Arturo Villalobos, who nominally ran 3 of the entities out of a UPS mailbox in Laredo. The warrant was approved on July 14, 2023. For 6 weeks, it delivered almost nothing. Villalobos's calls were mostly to a girlfriend in Corpus Christi and a bookie he owed money to, until, on August 30th, at 11:47 p.m., the recording equipment at the monitoring facility failed during a 2-hour window, the exact window in which Villalobos placed and received 4 calls to a Mexican cell number, later linked to Matamoros. A technician doing routine checks at 1:15 a.m. found the fault, a corroded capacitor on an aging line card, the kind of part that should have been replaced in a scheduled hardware refresh 18 months earlier, but hadn't been, because the monitoring facility was running on a maintenance budget nobody had prioritized. The recordings simply didn't exist. A technical failure, a blown fuse in an aging piece of monitoring hardware, had erased what might have been the case's fastest path to Tamaulipas. Torres called it, in a later deposition, the worst night of the investigation. Cruz didn't disagree. They had a warrant, a target, and a 4-call window that told them everything and gave them nothing. They didn't have the calls. What they still had was Villalobos himself. And a month later, in October 2023, agents caught a break they hadn't engineered. A man who worked as a courier for 2 of the 61 entities, moving cash from Houston area collection points to a bank in Brownsville, got pulled over for a broken taillight outside Kingsville with $94,000 in a gym bag in his trunk. The case had gone dark for 6 weeks. Then a broken taillight cracked it back open. The courier, a 26-year-old named Jonas Prieto, wasn't arrested that night. State troopers logged the cash, ran it through a K-9 alert, and referred it to the FBI, given the amount and Prieto's employment history at one of the flagged Shell ministries. What nobody in that traffic stop knew yet was that Prieto was 2 weeks from being approached for a proffer session that would change the entire shape of the investigation. Torres and Cruz spent November and December 2023 building pressure on Prieto through his employer, careful not to tip their hand. He was, by all accounts, not a hardened operator, a nephew of one of the Shell directors, given a job because he needed one, paid in cash to drive routes he didn't ask questions about. On January 11, 2024, agents approached him directly. He agreed to cooperate 3 days later, on January 14th, in exchange for consideration on any charges arising from the traffic stop. The proffer session itself ran nearly 6 hours inside a nondescript conference room at the Houston field office. No windows, a single legal pad and a recorder on the table, between Prieto and his court-appointed attorney on one side, Torres, and an assistant U.S. attorney on the other. Prieto was nervous enough that agents brought him a bottle of water twice in the first hour, and he asked, more than once, whether his aunt, the Shell director's wife, who'd gotten him the job, would end up going to prison because of what he was about to say. Nobody in the room could promise him she wouldn't. He talked anyway. Torres later described the session as the moment the case stopped being a paper trail and became a story, with real people standing inside it. People who hadn't necessarily wanted to be part of a cartel's money pipeline, but had needed a job and hadn't asked enough questions about where the cash in the gym bags actually came from. Prieto gave them their first real map. He described mission trips, twice-yearly church-organized trips to Tamaulipas, ostensibly to deliver aid supplies and build houses for the poor. He'd driven the support van on 2 of them. What he described wasn't charity work. Volunteers built a handful of houses for cameras and donor newsletters. The vans themselves, on the return leg, carried cash, not drugs, cash, proceeds already laundered on the Mexican side that needed a clean entry point back into the U.S. banking system, disguised as returning missionaries with donation boxes. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Why would a cartel launder cash by driving it south, through a border checkpoint, just to bring it back north days later? The answer Prieto gave agents was almost elegant in its cynicism. A van full of church volunteers with clergy letters and mission paperwork drew almost no scrutiny at the bridge. A charity's own donation boxes made perfect containers. The trip wasn't laundering the money coming back. It was laundering the story. What strikes us about this case is how little of it required anything technically sophisticated. No offshore shells in exotic jurisdictions. No cryptocurrency mixers. Just paperwork that looked boring enough that nobody wanted to check it twice, and a community too grateful for the help to ask hard questions of the man handing it out. Prieto's information pointed agents toward a bank. Gulf Coast Community Bank, a mid-sized Houston institution with 14 branches, handled roughly 40% of the wire traffic tied to the 61 shells. Federal regulations require banks to file a suspicious activity report, known as a SAR, for cash transactions structured to avoid the $10,000 reporting threshold. Agents pulled the bank's SAR filing history for the relevant accounts. There wasn't one. Not a single filing across 8 years of activity that, on its face, should have triggered dozens. That absence had a name attached to it. Susan Blake, 47, the branch compliance officer, responsible for exactly the accounts in question. If you've ever wondered how an entire financial pipeline moves $340 million without a single red flag reaching a regulator, here's your answer. It usually isn't a mastermind outsmarting the system. It's one person, at one desk, deciding not to file one form, multiplied by 8 years. Blake had worked at Gulf Coast Community Bank for 19 years without a disciplinary mark on her file. Colleagues described her as meticulous, almost to a fault, the kind of employee who color-coded her own compliance binders and reminded junior tellers about reporting thresholds unprompted. Records agents later obtained showed she'd flagged 3 large cash deposits internally as early as 2018, and then, in each case, personally overrode her own flag within 72 hours, citing verified nonprofit donor activity. Financial records subpoenaed from her personal accounts in February 2024 showed deposits totaling $340,000 over 6 years from an account linked to one of the 61 shells, structured in amounts just under $9,000 at a time. The same structuring technique, agents noted, that the shell network itself used to stay under the federal reporting threshold, as if Blake had simply applied the lesson she was supposed to be catching to her own paycheck. Agents didn't move on Blake immediately. Instead, through the spring of 2024, they built the case outward from her, mapping which of the 61 entities routed through her branch specifically, and cross-referencing every wire against the building fund ledger Ruiz had copied 2 years earlier. Slowly, painstakingly, 2 records that were never meant to be compared, Harvest Grace's private internal spreadsheet and a federally regulated bank's wire logs, lined up almost perfectly. 94% of building fund disbursements agents traced had passed through an account Blake personally serviced. We'll say what most won't. A compliance officer flagging and then quietly reversing her own red flags for 6 straight years is not a gap in the system. It's the system working exactly as badly as it was allowed to, because nobody above her ever asked why deposit patterns that looked suspicious in 2018 still looked suspicious, unresolved, in 2024. The bank's own internal audit team should have caught what one branch employee kept burying. They never did. By April 2024, agents had a name for their biggest remaining question. Every wire eventually pointed south of the border, toward the same region, Tamaulipas, and specifically the area around Matamoros, directly across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas. Somewhere down there, someone was originating the cash. Somewhere down there, someone was deciding which shell got how much and when. That someone had a name. Agents first heard it from Prieto, who knew him only as El Ingeniero, the engineer. Financial records and a DEA liaison in the Matamoros consulate eventually attached a real name, Hector Villarreal, 38, believed to manage financial operations for the Gulf Cartel's Matamoros Plaza on behalf of Diego Montoya. A second name surfaced alongside his, Ramon Salgado, 31, who, according to intercepted communications between Mexican federal police and DEA liaisons, handled the structuring side, deciding exact dollar amounts designed to stay just under reporting thresholds, spread across the 61 accounts like water finding cracks in a foundation. Neither man had ever set foot in the United States. Neither man ever would. Not voluntarily. And that fact alone created a problem Torres and Cruz couldn't wiretap or subpoena their way around. I spent hours going through the case file notes from this stretch of the investigation, and one detail kept nagging me. A single wire, sent March 3, 2023, for exactly $2,500,000, a perfectly round number, tagged simply, Building Fund, Disaster Reserve. Real donors don't usually give in numbers that clean. Real capital campaigns don't land on exactly $2.5 million without a pledge drive, a gala, a naming rights plaque. This wire had none of that. It existed, fully formed, in one transfer. Agents traced its origin back through 4 intermediary accounts, a process that took nearly 5 months of subpoenas across 2 countries. What they found at the end of the chain, confirmed through DEA financial intelligence in July 2024, was a residential property in Matamoros used as a documented cartel stash house, a location Mexican federal authorities had already surveilled twice in prior years without making an arrest. The $2.5 million hadn't come from a donor. It had come from a room full of counted cash, one province away from the pulpit where Kessler stood every Sunday, thanking his congregation for their generosity. That's the sub-mystery closed. The building fund wasn't a donor's generosity dressed up in paperwork. It was cartel profit, dressed up in exactly the same paperwork a real donor's gift would use, because nobody at the bank, the IRS, or the state nonprofit registry had ever built a form that could tell the difference. Put yourself in Torres's position for a second. You now know, with real confidence, where the money starts and where it ends. You know the names of 2 men who will never willingly walk into an American courtroom. You know a pastor is standing at a pulpit every Sunday, praying over cash he knows didn't come from his congregation's wallets. And you cannot move yet, because moving too early means Villarreal and Salgado shut down the pipeline, scatter the 61 accounts, and disappear back into a plaza system that has survived worse investigations than yours. What would you have done, sitting on a case this size, knowing that one wrong subpoena tips the whole thing over? Summer 2024 brought the investigation's worst human setback, a second courier. A woman in her 20s who worked administrative duties for 3 of the 61 shells and had quietly agreed to a proffer session scheduled for August 5th, missed her appointment. Agents went to her apartment in Pasadena, Texas, the next day. She was gone. Moved out overnight. No forwarding address. Phone disconnected. Her landlord told agents she'd paid 2 months' back rent in cash the week before, in full, something she'd never done in the 18 months she'd lived there. She has never been located. Whether she fled on her own fear or was warned off by someone inside the network remains, as of this recording, an open question the case file doesn't answer. Losing her stung, and it forced a decision. Torres and Cruz had planned to spend another 2 to 3 months building out the 61 entity map before moving to indictment. The vanished witness meant somebody, somewhere, might already suspect the net was closing. Waiting longer risked losing everything else, too. On August 12, 2024, the case moved to a federal grand jury on an accelerated timeline. Here's an unpopular opinion, and it'll probably draw some pushback. Diane Kessler deserves at least as much scrutiny in this case as her husband, and in the early press coverage, she barely got a mention next to him. Raymond Kessler built the relationships and stood at the pulpit, but every internal spreadsheet agents recovered, every private BF tab, every override of a bank compliance flag traced back to systems she personally maintained. If Raymond Kessler was the face of Harvest Grace, Diane Kessler was its engine room, and engine rooms are where the actual laundering gets done. Is this justice finally catching up to a genuine predator, or a system that let it run for 9 years because nobody wanted to be the one questioning a hurricane relief hero? We'd like to hear where you land on that, because both things can be true at once, and this case is a genuinely uncomfortable example of it. Grand jury proceedings ran through August and September 2024, hearing testimony from Ruiz, from Prieto, from a forensic accountant who walked jurors through 8 years of the building fund ledger, line by line, page by page from the 4,000-page entity book Priya Nair had built the year before. One juror reportedly asked, partway through the second day of testimony, whether it was even legal for a church to receive this much oversight, a question the presiding prosecutor answered by reminding the panel that no one was being asked to judge Harvest Grace's theology, only its bank records. 61 shell entities, 14 banks across 4 states, one compliance officer whose signature, or lack of one, appeared everywhere the money should have been stopped and wasn't. On September 30th, 2024, the grand jury returned sealed indictments against 58 defendants: Raymond Kessler, Diane Kessler, Susan Blake, 19 nominal directors of Shell Ministries, including Arturo Villalobos, Hector Villarreal, and Ramon Salgado, indicted in absentia, unlikely ever to see the inside of an American courtroom, given their presence inside cartel-controlled territory in Tamaulipas. 34 additional defendants tied to specific entities, wire transfers or structured deposits. The charges: conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, bank fraud, and multiple counts under the Bank Secrecy Act for willful failure to file suspicious activity reports. Prosecutors calculated the total laundered funds at $340 million between 2016 and 2024, making it, by the U.S. Attorney's own later characterization, the largest faith-based money laundering prosecution the Houston field office had ever built. 2 weeks of silent preparation followed. Raid teams across Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico synchronized warrants for a single morning, coordinating across 5 separate U.S. attorneys' offices and 2 state police agencies to make sure no defendant in one jurisdiction could tip off a co-conspirator in another before every door was hit at once. Coordination with Mexican federal police secured a parallel search of the Matamoros property tied to the $2.5 million wire, though agents there knew going in that Villarreal and Salgado themselves would almost certainly not be present. At 5:58 a.m. on October 15, 2024, it began. 40 agents moved on the Harvest Grace campus in southwest Houston. Simultaneously, teams hit the Kesslers' home in Sugar Land, a Gulf Coast community bank branch on Bel Air Boulevard, and 11 other addresses tied to Shell Ministries in Baton Rouge, Tulsa, and Albuquerque. The Sugar Land team parked 2 houses down and approached on foot in the dark, knocking at 6:09 a.m. with a battering ram staged but never needed. Raymond Kessler answered his own front door in a bathrobe, initially believing it was a delivery. Raymond Kessler was taken into custody in his home office at 6:14 a.m., reportedly in the middle of preparing a Sunday sermon titled, "Faithful with Little," the printed outline still sitting in the office printer tray when agents photographed the scene. Diane Kessler was arrested 20 minutes later at the same address, having gone to a back bedroom, agents believe, to attempt to reach an attorney by phone before agents secured the house. Susan Blake was arrested at her home in Katy, Texas, before her scheduled shift began, standing in her kitchen, in scrub-style work clothes, with a travel mug of coffee already poured. In Matamoros, Mexican federal police executed a coordinated search of the residential property tied to the $2.5 million wire. They found cash-counting machines, ledgers matching entries agents had already traced from the U.S. side, and, in a locked room off the kitchen, 3 AR-15 rifles and a stockpile of ammunition consistent with cartel enforcement operations, rather than a family residence. Villarreal and Salgado were not there. Both remain at large as of this recording, believed to still be operating inside Gulf Cartel-controlled territory under Diego Montoya's protection. By 11 a.m. that same morning, 58 indictments were unsealed inside the federal courthouse in downtown Houston. Reporters who'd covered Kessler as a civic hero for nearly a decade filled the gallery to watch him arraigned in a gray jumpsuit, hands cuffed at his waist, no microphone, no podium, no cameras rolling on his terms this time. Several members of the Harvest Grace congregation, including Maria Delgado, sat in the courtroom's public rows, some still not fully able to reconcile the man being led in by U.S. Marshals with the pastor who'd prayed over their sick relatives and blessed their children's baptisms for over a decade. Investigators seized $47 million in assets that morning alone: bank accounts, the Sugar Land home, 2 commercial properties tied to Shell entities, and a fleet of 11 box trucks registered to Harvest Grace. Total recovery efforts, prosecutors said, would likely take years and never approach the full $340 million, most of which had already been converted into real estate, vehicles, and cash, long since spent or moved beyond reach. Here's the part almost nobody expected walking into arraignment. Susan Blake, the compliance officer whose missing SAR filings had let the whole pipeline run undetected for 6 years, was the first defendant to signal she'd cooperate. Within 72 hours of her arrest, her attorney opened plea discussions with federal prosecutors, offering detailed testimony about which Gulf Coast Community Bank executives, if any, had known about the pattern of overridden flags. As of this recording, that question, how far up the bank's chain of command the knowledge went, remains unresolved and is expected to shape a second wave of charges. Raymond and Diane Kessler have both pleaded not guilty. Their trial is scheduled for early 2025. Prosecutors have signaled they will seek the maximum available under federal sentencing guidelines for money laundering conspiracy at this scale, which could mean decades for both defendants given the dollar amount involved. 19 of the Shell Ministry directors, including Arturo Villalobos, have begun entering plea negotiations, several reportedly cooperating in exchange for reduced exposure. David Ruiz, the accountant who refused to sign a single set of financial statements back in March 2022, has not returned to nonprofit accounting. He's been in protective contact with federal prosecutors throughout the case and is expected to testify at trial. Under IRS whistleblower provisions, he may also be eligible for a percentage of any funds the government successfully recovers. Though given how much of the $340 million has already vanished into real estate and cash nobody will ever trace, nobody involved is expecting that number to be large. Ruiz has said through his attorney that he didn't do it for the money. He did it because he had a 2-year-old daughter and didn't want to explain to her someday why he'd signed something he knew was a lie. Jonas Prieto, the courier caught with $94,000 in a gym bag over a broken taillight, received a reduced cooperation agreement and is not expected to serve significant additional time beyond what he's already spent under supervised release. The second courier, the woman who vanished before her scheduled proffer session in August 2024, has still not been located. Her absence remains the one thread in this case. Nobody has been able to close. Diego Montoya, the Gulf Cartel Plaza boss believed to have ultimate authority over the Matamoros laundering operation, was never indicted. He remains, as of this recording, at large in Tamaulipas, believed to still control cartel financial operations in the region. Hector Villarreal and Ramon Salgado remain fugitives as well, protected by geography and by a cartel structure that has weathered larger losses than one Houston church. What this case actually exposed, more than any single defendant's guilt, is a gap nobody in Washington has closed. Religious nonprofits in the United States receive lighter IRS financial scrutiny than almost any other category of tax-exempt organization, a protection built for good reasons. The government generally shouldn't be auditing what a congregation believes. But that same protection means a bad actor with a collection plate and a decent public relations instinct can move more money with less oversight than almost any other kind of business front available to organized crime. Congress has held exactly 0 hearings on this case as of this recording. We'd guess that changes, eventually. We wouldn't bet on it changing fast. Would you have noticed the signs, sitting in that congregation every Sunday, watching a pastor you trusted pray over a building fund that never quite made sense? Most of Harvest Grace's members say, honestly, they wouldn't have. That's not naivety. That's what trust is supposed to feel like, and it's exactly the texture organized crime has always known how to exploit. Maria Delgado still attends services at a different church now, 3 miles from the old Harvest Grace campus, which sits boarded up and marshal-sealed as of this recording. Its blue neon cross finally, for the first time in over a decade, dark. There's a detail in the grand jury exhibits that stuck with us more than almost anything else in this case. Buried in one of Diane Kessler's private spreadsheets, next to a building fund entry from December 2019, is a single note in the margin, confirm before Sunday announcement, don't want questions. Not a criminal admission by itself, just a small, ordinary instinct to manage appearances, the same instinct that runs most institutions everywhere. It's the instinct that, left unchecked for 9 years, became a $340 million pipeline for the Gulf Cartel. There's a piece of this case we couldn't fully verify for this video. Reporting from a source close to the Matamoros search suggests investigators found ledgers referencing at least one additional U.S. city not yet named in the unsealed indictment. If that holds up, there may be a second wave of charges coming. Comment more below if you want us to follow this story once that piece is confirmed. 58 indictments unsealed in one morning. 61 Shell ministries mapped across 4 states. 1 accountant who wouldn't sign a piece of paper, and 1 compliance officer who signed off on the same red flag 6 years running. $340 million moved through a church that most of Houston still remembers as a hurricane relief hero. The trial starts in early 2025. Diego Montoya is still out there. Villarreal and Salgado are still out there. And somewhere in Houston, a congregation that thought it was funding food pantries and mission trips is still trying to understand what it actually funded instead. If this is the kind of case that gets under your skin the way it got under ours, there's another Gulf Cartel investigation out of the Houston field office we've covered that connects to some of the same banking corridors. Check the channel for it. And if you made it this far, you already know more about how this laundering pipeline worked than most of the people who sat in those pews every Sunday for 9 years. Subscribe for the trial coverage when it starts, because this one isn't over.